A small, portable wireless set sat on the dinner table at Chequers, the country residence of British Prime Ministers, on the evening of December 7, 1941. The radio had been carried in by Frank Sawyers, the host's longtime valet, because the host had asked for the 9 o'clock news. The host was 67 years old and, according to the man sitting nearest him at the table, looked tired and depressed. Averell Harriman, who would later set down his recollection of that evening in his memoir Special Envoy, wrote that the Prime Minister did not have much to say through dinner and was immersed in his thoughts, with his head in his hands part of the time. The host was Winston Spencer Churchill. The room held 8 people. 2 of them were Americans, and they were the reason the dinner was happening at all. Averell Harriman, President Roosevelt's special envoy to Europe and the man overseeing the Lease program from London, was on one side of the table. His daughter, Kathleen, who was about to turn 24, had been celebrated the previous night with a birthday cake and a signed copy of one of the Prime Minister's earlier books, his 1899 history of the Sudan campaign called The River War. The third American at the gathering, John Gilbert Winant, the United States ambassador to Britain, was also present. Clementine Churchill was upstairs unwell. The Prime Minister's daughter-in-law, Pamela Churchill, was at the table along with General Hastings Ismay, John Martin, and Commander Tommy Thompson, the Prime Minister's naval aide. The radio crackled to life with the headlines. There was a tank battle in Libya, south of Tobruk, where the British were not doing well. There was news from Hong Kong. There was reporting on Japanese troop concentrations in Indochina. Then, in the more detailed bulletin that followed the headlines, the announcer read out a sentence that caught Harriman's ear. Japanese aircraft, he said, had raided Pearl Harbor, the American naval base in Hawaii. Harriman repeated the words almost to himself, as if he were testing whether he had heard them right. From across the table, Tommy Thompson interrupted. "Pearl River," he said. "Not Pearl Harbor." The 2 men argued briefly. The announcer moved on to other items. A few moments later, Sawyers reappeared at the door and confirmed it. The kitchen staff had heard the same broadcast on a different set. The Japanese, he said, had attacked the Americans. What happened in the next 30 seconds is the moment this entire investigation turns on, because Winston Churchill, who had spent the previous 18 months wooing, cajoling, and at moments almost begging the United States to enter the war, did not respond like a man who had just received catastrophic news. He responded like a man who had received the news he had been praying for. He stood up from the table, moved toward the door, and said the words, "We shall declare war on Japan." Ambassador Winant, alarmed, followed him out and reportedly told him, "Good God, you can't declare war on a radio announcement." Churchill placed a transatlantic call to the White House. President Roosevelt confirmed the news directly. The 2 men spoke briefly, and later, when the guests had dispersed and the great house had gone quiet, the Prime Minister composed in his own thoughts the line he would, 8 years later, set down in his memoirs, that he went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. That phrase, the sleep of the saved and thankful, was not Churchill's diary entry from that night. It was the line he chose, 8 years later, when he came to write up his recollections in the 3rd volume of his war memoirs, The Grand Alliance. Historians who have worked through the original manuscript drafts, including David Reynolds of Cambridge University in his book In Command of History, have shown that the published version is a carefully shaped account, more polished than the contemporaneous record. Churchill spent much of the night on the telephone and on cables to Washington and the Admiralty. The serenity of the famous sentence belongs to the writer in 1949 looking back, not to the Prime Minister at the moment. But the meaning behind it, that is the real thing, and that is what we have to explain, because the American Pacific Fleet had been gutted that morning. Battleships were burning at their moorings. More than 2,400 Americans were dead. Britain's most powerful potential ally had just been struck the most devastating military blow in its history, and Winston Churchill, when he came to remember the moment years later, framed it as the night he and his country had been saved. This is the story of why he believed it. Why, on the night of the worst surprise attack in American military history, the leader of America's closest ally went to sleep, believing the war was over, even though it would last for nearly 4 more years. The story of what Churchill could see in that moment that almost nobody else in the world could see. The story of the 18 months of private desperation, the secret correspondence, the failed promises, the courtship that came so close to collapse, and the single moment when all of it became irrelevant because the only thing that mattered had finally happened. To understand it, we have to begin not at Chequers, but in a different room more than a year and a half earlier, where a man who had just been made Prime Minister sat down to write a letter to a president he barely knew, with the survival of his country resting on whether the president would write back. May 15, 1940. 5 days into Churchill's premiership. The German army was tearing through Belgium and northern France with a speed nobody had seen coming. 2 days earlier, in his first speech to the House of Commons as Prime Minister, Churchill had used the phrase that would echo through the rest of the century. He had told Parliament he had nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. The phrase made very little impression at the time. The members of Parliament around him were polite, but they were not yet sure what to make of him. In Washington, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt read about the speech and registered nothing in particular. He was a man who measured his moves carefully. He was running for an unprecedented third term. The American public, by overwhelming majority, did not want to enter another European war. The memory of 1917 and 1918 was still raw. Roosevelt had to navigate between the obvious threat of Adolf Hitler and an American Congress that contained powerful isolationists who would block any open alliance. Churchill understood this perfectly. He also understood something the history books often gloss over. He understood that without the United States, Britain would lose, not might lose, but would lose. He had run the numbers. The British Empire was vast on paper, but in raw industrial terms, the country was already beginning to bleed itself dry. By the time Churchill became Prime Minister, Britain's gold reserves were running down at a rate that would exhaust them within months. The country was importing more than 1 million tons of food, fuel, and raw materials every week, and the German submarines in the Atlantic were sinking those imports faster than they could be replaced. Britain could fight, and Britain could endure. But Britain alone could not, in the long arithmetic of total war, win. So on May 15, 1940, Churchill sat down and wrote his first letter to Roosevelt as Prime Minister. He signed it Former Naval Person, a code name he had used in his earlier correspondence as First Lord of the Admiralty, because he wanted to remind Roosevelt of the bond between two men who had both served their navies in the previous war. He wrote, "If necessary, we shall continue the war alone, and we are not afraid of that." He hinted that France might soon fall. He asked for old American destroyers, for aircraft, for anti-aircraft guns, for steel, for everything. The letter was the beginning of a correspondence that would eventually run to nearly 2,000 letters and telegrams between the two men by the war's end. By the time Pearl Harbor came, more than 200 messages had already passed between them. Churchill wrote at all hours of the night, working through phrasings the way a poet works through stanzas, and every sentence he sent across the Atlantic was calibrated to do one thing, which was to bring the Americans closer. Just a little. Just enough. In June 1940, France fell. The British Expeditionary Force was evacuated from Dunkirk. The Royal Navy, in one of the most painful decisions Churchill ever made, attacked the French fleet at the Algerian port of Mers el-Kebir to prevent it from falling into German hands. Then came the Battle of Britain. From July through October of 1940, the Royal Air Force fought the Luftwaffe in the skies above southern England in a battle that Churchill himself would describe with the words that fewer have ever owed so much to so few. By September, German bombers were attacking London almost every night. The Blitz had begun. More than 40,000 British civilians would die from German bombing during the war, almost half of them in London itself. More than 1 million homes would be destroyed or damaged. And through every night of the Blitz, in his bunker beneath the Treasury building or in the shelters of Downing Street, Churchill kept writing. The letters went out. The arguments grew sharper. In December 1940, with British gold reserves nearly exhausted, he sent Roosevelt one of the most carefully written letters of his life, in which he laid out without disguise the fact that Britain could no longer pay for the supplies it was buying from American factories. Roosevelt read that letter on a fishing trip aboard the presidential yacht. He thought about it for weeks. And then, in one of the most consequential moves of any American president in the 20th century, he proposed a plan to lend, not sell, the weapons of war to Britain. The plan was given the name Lend-Lease. It was introduced to Congress in January 1941 as House Bill 1776, deliberately numbered for the year of American independence. It passed in March. By the end of the war, more than $50 billion worth of supplies, equivalent in modern terms to roughly $700 billion, would be sent to Britain, the Soviet Union, and other Allied nations. Of that, more than $31 billion would go to Britain alone. Lend-Lease was the lifeline that kept Britain in the war. But it was not enough, and Churchill knew it. Material help, however generous, was not the same as American soldiers, American sailors, American factories running at full wartime capacity for a single shared cause. In January 1941, Roosevelt sent his closest advisor, Harry Hopkins, to London on what was supposed to be a brief mission to assess British morale. Hopkins was a thin, ill, intensely intelligent man who had once been Secretary of Commerce and now lived in a second-floor bedroom of the White House. He had had part of his stomach removed for cancer years earlier and survived on willpower and a steady diet of cigarettes and weak coffee. Churchill recognized him immediately as the most important American he had ever met. He took Hopkins everywhere, to bombed cities, to shipyards, to ruined ports, and he talked to Hopkins for hours. At a dinner in Glasgow in late January, with Tom Johnston, the regional commissioner for Scotland, as host, Hopkins rose to give a toast. He quoted from the Book of Ruth. "Whither thou goest, I will go," he said. "And where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God." Then he added quietly, "Even to the end." Churchill, by the contemporaneous diary of his physician, Lord Moran, wept openly at the table. He had been waiting 18 months for an American to say something like that. Hopkins eventually broadcast a message to the British people in which he told them, in a voice ringing with conviction, that they were not fighting alone. Churchill, watching, would later affectionately call Hopkins Lord Root of the Matter, because Hopkins always cut to the heart of any problem. In April 1941, Roosevelt sent another American to London. This time it was John Gilbert Winant, a former Republican governor of New Hampshire, to replace the previous American ambassador, Joseph Kennedy, who had become deeply pessimistic about Britain's chances of survival. Kennedy had told the Boston Sunday Globe in November 1940 that democracy in Britain was finished. Winant arrived with a different message. When his train reached the small platform at Windsor, King George VI himself was waiting to greet him and led him personally to a waiting car for the drive to Windsor Castle. The historian Lynn Olson, in her study of the Americans in wartime London, has noted that no foreign envoy had been received with such ceremony in living memory. Churchill understood symbolism, so did the king. Winant became, over the following months, the quiet third channel between London and Washington, alongside Hopkins and Harriman. In August 1941, Churchill travelled in secret aboard the battleship HMS Prince of Wales to Placentia Bay in Newfoundland to meet Roosevelt for the first time. The two men met aboard the American cruiser, USS Augusta. They produced a joint declaration called the Atlantic Charter, 8 principles for the post-war world, including the right of all peoples to choose their own form of government, freedom from fear and want, freedom of the seas, and a system of general security. The charter was a triumph of moral language. It was also, from Churchill's private point of view, a disappointment. He had crossed an ocean in submarine-infested waters, hoping to bring back an American commitment to enter the war. He came back with a press release. Roosevelt, the shrewder of the two in personal politics, had given the British public exactly what would lift their morale and committed nothing in writing that could be used against him by isolationists in Congress. Churchill returned to London still alone. The British people were eating less than they had eaten before the war. Food rationing had begun in January 1940. By June 1941, even clothing was rationed, with each person allocated 66 points a year. By February 1942, soap would be rationed too. The Ministry of Food was telling housewives how to make do with 1 egg a week and 4 ounces of bacon. Children were being told to eat raw carrots on a stick because there was no ice cream. The government had banned the importation of bananas in November 1940. Beekeeping families received special sugar allotments because honey was now a strategic resource, and in the Atlantic, German submarines continued to sink merchant ships. More than 1,300 Allied and neutral vessels would be lost to all enemy action in 1941. The German submarine commander, Admiral Karl Donitz, was running what the Germans called wolf packs, coordinated groups of submarines that could intercept and shred entire convoys at sea. The British coined a phrase for the worst stretch of these losses. They called it the Battle of the Atlantic, a name Churchill himself first used in a directive in early March 1941. Britain needed more than 1 million tons of imported food and supplies every week to survive. When the convoys did not get through, the country did not eat. Britain was holding on, but it was holding on by its fingernails. There was something else weighing on Churchill that autumn. He had been reading every signal British intelligence could intercept about Japanese intentions in the Pacific, and he was deeply afraid of what he privately called being at war with Japan without or before the United States. He had said as much in a personal message to Harry Hopkins in late August 1941, warning of the depression spreading through the British cabinet at the president's repeated assurances of no commitments. If Japan attacked British possessions in Southeast Asia and the Americans stayed neutral, the consequences for the British Empire would be catastrophic, with Singapore, Hong Kong, and possibly even India exposed to attack. The Royal Navy did not have the ships to defend 2 oceans at once, and it was already being torn at by U-boats in the Atlantic. So Churchill, in the days before December 7, was watching the Pacific the way a man watches a storm front he cannot outrun. He wanted American protection in the Pacific even more urgently than he wanted American troops in Europe. What he did not know, what no one knew, was that the storm was about to break in a way that would resolve every question in a single morning. This was the country, and this was the Prime Minister, who sat down to dinner at Chequers on the evening of December 7, 1941, with 2 American guests and a small portable wireless set on the table. Now hold that picture in your mind, because we have to step away from Chequers for a moment to understand what was happening at that exact same hour, half a world away, in a place neither Winston Churchill nor anyone else in that dining room had ever seen. In Hawaii, the time was just before 8 in the morning local time. The Pacific Fleet of the United States Navy lay at anchor in the calm waters of Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. 8 battleships rode at their moorings along Battleship Row. Hundreds of aircraft sat parked in tight rows on the airfields nearby, packed close together to make them easier to guard against sabotage. American sailors were just beginning their Sunday morning routines, some at breakfast, some at church services, many still asleep. The attack opened at 7:48 in the morning on the outlying airfields, with bombs falling on Pearl Harbor itself by 7:55. 353 Japanese aircraft, launched in 2 waves from 6 carriers under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, struck Battleship Row and the surrounding fields. Within the next 2 hours, every one of the 8 American battleships present had been hit. 5 were sunk, 3 were damaged. 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers were destroyed or crippled. 188 American aircraft were destroyed on the ground, most of them lined up wingtip to guard against sabotage. 2,403 Americans were killed, civilian and military combined. 1,178 were wounded. The USS Arizona, hit by an armor-piercing bomb that detonated her forward magazines, exploded with such force that her bow lifted out of the water. 1,177 of her crew died with her. Many of them are still entombed in her wreckage. The architect of the attack was a Japanese admiral named Isoroku Yamamoto, and he was not, on the day after Pearl Harbor, in any mood to celebrate. While his staff officers raised glasses to the success of the operation, Yamamoto, by the recollection of those around him, sat sunk in apparent depression. He had been against the war from the start. In late 1940, when Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe had asked him directly what would happen if Japan fought the United States, Yamamoto had answered with a sentence that would later be quoted in every serious history of the Pacific War. If he was told to fight regardless of the consequences, he said, he could run wild for the first 6 months or a year. After that, he had utterly no confidence in what would come. He had reasons to know what he was talking about. He had studied at Harvard from 1919 to 1921. He had served as Japanese naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. He had ridden American trains across the continent. He had toured the Texas oil fields and the Detroit auto plants. He had counted, with the cold attention of a professional gambler, what the United States could put into the field once it decided to go. The men around him in Tokyo had not seen those things, and they did not believe him. He understood, with mathematical clarity, the same thing Winston Churchill understood that night on the other side of the world. The numbers were not on Japan's side. They had never been on Japan's side. The United States in 1941 was already producing more industrial output than Germany and Japan combined, and its gross national product was more than twice the size of those two economies put together. Detroit alone, the entire American auto industry across Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, and the smaller manufacturers, had built more than 3 million passenger vehicles in the calendar year. Once those assembly lines were turned to military production, the result would be a flood of weapons and aircraft and trucks unlike anything in human history. By 1944, the United States would build more military aircraft in a single year than Japan had built in all the war years combined. American shipyards would launch enough vessels that by the autumn of 1943, all Allied shipping sunk since the start of the war had already been replaced. By the time the war ended, the United States would account for roughly 40% of global industrial output, more than any other nation in history to that point. The figures hide an even more striking detail. In 1939, the active United States regular army had numbered fewer than 200,000 men. By the rankings of the day, it was a smaller force than the Army of Portugal. American military aircraft production that same year had been less than 3,000 planes. By the end of the war, it would reach roughly 300,000. The country that had been mocked by German strategists as a nation of comfort and commerce would, within 40 months of Pearl Harbor, be operating fleets and air forces and armies of a scale that Germany and Japan could not match even if they pooled every factory, mine, and shipyard between them. The Soviet leader Joseph Stalin understood this clearly. At the Tehran Conference in late 1943, raising a toast in the presence of Roosevelt and Churchill, he said plainly that the most important things in this war were machines, that the United States was a country of machines, and that without those machines, delivered through Lease, the Allies would have lost the war. This was the boiler that Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary in the years before the First World War, had described to Winston Churchill in a phrase Churchill never forgot. Grey had told him that the United States was like a gigantic boiler. Once the fire is lighted under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate. On the night of December 7, 1941, the fire had just been lighted. Now think about what almost everyone else around Churchill that night was thinking. Ambassador Winant, a quiet, modest, deeply moral man who had taken Britain's cause to heart, was a former Republican governor of New Hampshire before he came to London. When he heard the news of Pearl Harbor, his first reaction, by every account we have of him, was sober and grim. He was thinking of the Americans who had just died, and of how the country he had left behind would now have to mobilize, train, equip, and ship across 2 oceans, an army it did not yet possess. Averell Harriman, harder, more transactional, more political, was thinking similar thoughts. So was Hopkins, far away in Washington, and so was Roosevelt himself. The American mood that evening was rage, grief, and a determination to fight. It was not joy. It was not the feeling of having won something. Churchill alone, in that company, slept the sleep of the saved. Why? If you have come this far in the story, the answer matters. So does the channel that brings you these investigations. Subscribing helps preserve the kind of detailed historical work that very few corners of the internet are still willing to do. The names, the dates, the sentences, exactly as they were said. The texture of how things actually happened. That is what we are here to keep alive. If this story is worth your time, the small act of subscribing keeps the work going. To answer the question, we have to look at what Churchill knew that almost no one else in the room could know. He had 3 things in his head that nobody else at that dining table had together. The first was a complete picture of British military and economic exhaustion in late 1941. As Prime Minister, he saw the figures Roosevelt did not yet see, the food stocks running low, the shipping losses outpacing new construction, the Royal Navy stretched across 3 oceans without the ships to hold all of them, and the British Army, a shadow of what it would need to be to one day retake Europe after being forced out of France, then Greece, then Crete. The second thing in his head was the exact, quantitative scale of American industrial potential, learned from Lend-Lease reports and from long evenings of conversation with Harriman, who oversaw the program from London. Once American factories were fully unleashed for war, the output would be staggering, and no German or Japanese production could match it. The third thing was the most important of all. Pearl Harbor would unite the American public the way no diplomatic argument ever could. The isolationists who had blocked Lend-Lease for months, who had argued against every step toward intervention, who had filled the speeches of Senator Burton Wheeler and the radio broadcasts of Charles Lindbergh, had just been silenced in a single morning. Pearl Harbor was not merely an attack. It was a political event that would put America in the war with the full and undivided will of the American people behind it. For a year and a half, Churchill had been climbing a mountain alone. Now, in a single radio broadcast on a Sunday evening, he had been told that the mountain was on his side. Hitler made the picture complete. On December 11, 1941, 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag, sitting at the time in the Kroll Opera House, and declared war on the United States. He was not required to do this. The tripartite pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan was a defensive alliance, and Japan had been the attacker. Hitler's own staff was divided. But Hitler had always assumed war with the United States was inevitable, and he believed, with a certainty that historians have never fully explained, that the Americans were too soft and too divided to fight effectively in Europe. He had repeatedly dismissed the idea that American material aid could change the outcome of the war. He had been wrong before. He was wrong now. The historian Ian Kershaw, who has written more thoroughly than almost anyone on Hitler's wartime decisions, treats the declaration of war on the United States as one of the 10 fateful choices that shaped the world between 1940 and 1941. Germany was already overstretched on 2 fronts. The German army had failed to take Moscow earlier that month and was now retreating in the snow before a Soviet counteroffensive that had begun on December 5. Adding the United States, with its bottomless industrial capacity, to Germany's list of enemies served no German interest that Hitler could rationally explain. He appears to have done it because he believed in racial theories of national strength and weakness that told him the Americans were not capable of sustained warfare. He read in the American press about labor strikes, about isolationist senators, about the speeches of Charles Lindbergh, and he concluded that the country was hollow. He was diagnosing a society he did not understand. At Willow Run in Michigan, the Ford Motor Company would soon be running an assembly line that, at peak production, turned out one B-24 heavy bomber every 63 minutes. The historian Max Hastings has written that Hitler's declaration of war on the United States relieved Roosevelt from a serious uncertainty about whether Congress would have agreed to fight Germany. The American public, after Pearl Harbor, was fixated on Japan. Roosevelt had to find a way to bring Hitler and Mussolini into the war from the American side, because every strategist around him knew that Germany was the greater long-term threat. Hitler solved the problem for him. By December 11, the Grand Alliance, as Churchill would later call it, was complete. Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union, 3 of the 4 largest economies on Earth, were now at war with the Axis powers. Of the world's great industrial nations, only Japan and Germany were on the wrong side of that line, and both of them were already, in the cold mathematics of production, beaten. Within 2 weeks of Pearl Harbor, Churchill was on a battleship crossing the Atlantic again. This time he was sailing toward Washington, not Newfoundland, and this time he was no longer a supplicant. He was an ally. He spent Christmas at the White House, staying in the Rose bedroom on the 2nd floor, working until the early morning hours and dictating to his secretaries. On December 26, he addressed a joint meeting of the United States Congress in the Senate chamber, the first British Prime Minister ever to do so. He joked about his Anglo American heritage, his mother having been an American born in Brooklyn, and he asked, in the words that would echo through the rest of the war, what kind of a people they thought we were. It was at that moment that the world began to feel the difference. at the strategic conference codenamed Arcadia, which ran from December 22, 1941 to January 14, 1942, Churchill and Roosevelt and their senior commanders reaffirmed a fundamental principle that American war planners had first sketched in late 1940 under the codename Plan Dog and refined in the ABC-1 Staff Agreement of March 1941. Germany would be defeated first. Whatever happened in the Pacific, the main weight of Anglo American military power would be turned on Hitler. This was the strategy that would shape the rest of the war. It came directly out of the Grand Alliance that had been completed in those 4 December days between Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war. The Arcadia Conference produced something else, something that would echo far longer than the war itself. On January 1, 1942, in Washington, the representatives of the 4 leading Allied powers signed the declaration by United Nations, with 22 more governments signing the following day. It was the first formal use of that phrase to describe the coalition fighting the Axis. The text was drafted under State Department leadership and finalized at the White House over Christmas, with Hopkins helping pull the language together at Roosevelt's request. The phrase United Nations was chosen by Roosevelt himself and would, 4 years later, become the name of the organization that replaced the failed League of Nations and that still exists today. The seed of the post-war international order was planted in those Christmas weeks at the White House, with Churchill in his bathrobe stalking the corridors at 3 a.m. and Roosevelt in his wheelchair listening patiently as the Prime Minister thought aloud about empires and oceans. Churchill stayed in the Rose bedroom for 3 weeks, working through the night, drinking brandy, smoking cigars in bed. There is a famous story from those weeks in which Roosevelt, wheeling himself unannounced into the bedroom, found Churchill stepping out of his bath and is supposed to have heard the Prime Minister joke that he had nothing whatever to hide from the President of the United States. Churchill himself, when asked about the line by his own biographer Robert Sherwood, denied that he had ever said it. He pointed out that it was not strictly true and that the President would have known so. The encounter, however, did happen in some form, and what was unmistakable beyond the disputed wording was the easiness, the closeness, the working partnership the 2 men were forging at speed, having waited so long to find one another in person. Even the disasters that came in the weeks after Pearl Harbor did not shake Churchill's underlying confidence in the math. On December 10, 1941, Japanese aircraft sank the British battleship Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse off the coast of Malaya. The Prince of Wales was the same battleship that had carried Churchill to Newfoundland 4 months earlier. Around 840 British sailors died across the 2 ships, including Admiral Tom Phillips and Captain John Leach. Churchill, when the news reached him by telephone in the early morning hours, said simply that in all the war he had never received a more direct shock. Singapore, which Churchill had once called the Gibraltar of the East, fell to Japanese forces on February 15, 1942. Around 80,000 British, Indian and Australian troops surrendered there, with another 50,000 having already been taken in the Malayan campaign. It was the worst single defeat in British military history. And yet, even as those losses mounted, Churchill never wrote, in any letter or speech or private remark, that he doubted the eventual outcome. He had done the arithmetic on the night of December 7, and the arithmetic had not changed. But before we move forward into the strategy that shaped the next 4 years, there is a moment from those first hours that I want to come back to, because it is the moment that explains everything. On the night of December 7 itself, when Churchill telephoned the White House, Roosevelt confirmed the news directly. "We are all in the same boat now," the president said. The next day, after Congress had passed the formal declaration of war on Japan, Roosevelt sent Churchill a longer cable that opened with a sentence Churchill would never forget. "Today all of us," the president wrote, "are in the same boat with you and the people of the empire, and it is a ship which will not and cannot be sunk." Churchill, reading those words in London, had been waiting 18 months to read a sentence like that. If your father, your grandfather, or your great-grandfather served in the Second World War, in any branch, in any theatre, on any side of the Atlantic, I would be honoured to read about them in the comments below. The unit, the years they served, what they came home with, what they never spoke of. Those details, the small, specific personal things, are the actual history. They matter more than any cabinet minute or strategy paper. The names of the men who lived through those years deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them. Now we come to the part of the story that Churchill himself wrote, in his own hand, years later in his memoirs, and that historians have been arguing about ever since. Because Churchill, in The Grand Alliance, the third volume of his 6-volume history of the Second World War, did not simply describe the events of December 7. He described his feelings. And one historian, David Reynolds of Cambridge University, working through the original drafts of Churchill's manuscript decades later, found something remarkable. Churchill's first draft of the passage, describing Harriman and Winant's reaction to the news at Chequers, had been more candid than the published version. In the first draft, Churchill wrote that the two Americans had received the news with exultation. He wrote that they had nearly danced for joy. He had crossed those words out before publication. He replaced them with a more diplomatic phrase, writing instead that the Americans had taken the shock with admirable fortitude, that they had not wailed or lamented that their country was at war, that they had wasted no words in reproach or sorrow. Then he added a sentence that has stayed with every reader of the memoir ever since. One might almost have thought, he wrote, that they had been delivered from a long pain. Delivered from a long pain. That is the sentence in which Churchill, in his own quiet way, told the truth about that night. It was not just a British truth. It was an American truth too, even if the published memoir was too tactful to say so. The Americans in that room, the men who had been working with Churchill for months and watching the British struggle to hold on, had felt at some level the same release Churchill himself had felt. They could not say it out loud. Their countrymen were dying on the other side of the world. But they had also been carrying a burden, and the burden had just been lifted by the worst possible means. And here, as Churchill prepared the manuscript for publication years later, he reached for the line he had been carrying with him for decades. He thought of the remark Edward Grey had made to him before the First World War. The United States, Grey had said, is like a gigantic boiler. Once the fire is lighted under it, there is no limit to the power it can generate. Churchill wrote those words into the published version of his memoir as the closing thought of the chapter on Pearl Harbor. So here is the answer to the question this story has been asking from the beginning. Why did Churchill say we had won the night America joined the war? The answer is that Churchill, alone among the major figures of that night, was carrying in his head 3 pieces of information at once. He had the deep knowledge of British exhaustion that came from running the country for 19 months on the edge of collapse. He had the precise quantitative grasp of American industrial capacity that came from 18 months of correspondence with Roosevelt and direct conversation with Harriman. And he had the political instinct, sharpened by 40 years in British public life, to recognize that Pearl Harbor would do what no diplomacy could ever do. It would unite a divided American public around a shared enemy. He was not naive about what was still ahead. He wrote in the same passage, with a clarity that often gets edited out when the famous quotation is repeated, that he expected terrible forfeits in the East and that many disasters and immeasurable cost and tribulation lay ahead. He understood that Singapore would fall, though he probably did not yet know that the battleship Prince of Wales, which had carried him to Newfoundland in August, would be sunk by Japanese aircraft 3 days later off the coast of Malaya. The road would be long, but the outcome had been decided. He had won, not because the war was over, but because the war was now arithmetically winnable for the first time. The combined gross national product of the Allies was now several times that of the Axis. Combined industrial capacity, combined manpower, combined access to raw materials, all of it had tipped in the Allies' favor in a single weekend. Yamamoto saw this clearly the moment Pearl Harbor was over. Churchill saw it from a different angle, on the other side of the world. Adolf Hitler, in his Berlin chancellery, did not see it at all. Admiral Yamamoto sat in apparent depression on December 8. Prime Minister Churchill, when he later set the moment down on paper, framed December 7 as the night he had been saved. Both men were doing arithmetic in their heads, and they were getting the same answer. The only difference was that Yamamoto was on the losing side of the equation. There is a small detail I want to leave you with, because it captures something true about the night that the larger narrative often overlooks. When the news of Pearl Harbor came over the radio at Chequers, the first person at the table to speak the words out loud was not Churchill. It was Averell Harriman. He repeated the sentence as if to make sure he had heard it. The first person to misunderstand was Tommy Thompson, the Englishman, who thought the announcer had said Pearl River. The first to confirm it was Frank Sawyers, Churchill's valet, returning to the doorway from the kitchen where the staff had been listening on a different set. The kitchen staff knew before the dining room did. The valet told the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom that the Japanese had attacked the Americans, and only then did Churchill rise from his chair and start for the door. In that small chain of understanding, you can see how news arrived in the world before television, before instant communication, before any of the apparatus that would later make global events feel immediate. It came through a wireless set placed on a dinner table, repeated by an American who had been hoping for war, doubted by an Englishman who had served at sea, and confirmed by the man who had been responsible for the Prime Minister's daily life since 1939. Within hours, that small dining room would set in motion the strategic decisions that would shape the next 4 years of the war and the next 50 years of the world. Churchill, of course, never doubted what he had heard. By the time the dinner ended, he had already telephoned Roosevelt. By the next morning, he had begun to plan his trip to Washington, and by Christmas he was sleeping in the White House. By the following August, the joint Anglo American command structure that would eventually plan the invasion of North Africa, the invasion of Italy, and the invasion of Normandy was already taking shape on paper. He never lost sight of how close it had come. He had said, in a private conversation earlier in the war, that without America, Britain would lose. He meant it. Pearl Harbor turned the math around. From that night onward, the question was no longer whether the Allies would win. The question was how long the cost would be, and what kind of world would be left when it was over. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit that like button. It helps the work reach the viewers who care about getting the history right. Not the version that flatters one nation or condemns another, but the version that actually happened, with the names, the rooms, the small precise human moments intact. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are many of these stories. Most of them are about decisions that were made in a single hour, on a single night, by people who could not have known yet how those decisions would shape everything that came after. Winston Churchill went to bed on the night of December 7, 1941, after a dinner that had begun in depression and ended in something close to wonder. When he came to write up the moment for his memoirs years later, he reached for the language of a man who had been delivered, because, for the first time in 18 months as Prime Minister, he believed his country would survive. The cost of that survival had been paid in American blood at Pearl Harbor, and more would be paid in the years to come, on islands and beaches whose names the world would learn one by one. But the Grand Alliance had been born. Churchill, who had been carrying the weight of his country alone, was no longer carrying it alone. That was the thing he understood that night that almost nobody else around him could fully see. He was a man of immense flaws and immense gifts, and in the long, often unflattering accounting of history, he made decisions that historians will argue about for as long as the war is remembered. But on that one night, in that one quiet room at Chequers, with the wireless set still on the table and the news still ringing in his ears, he saw something true, and saw it clearly. He saw that the war was no longer his war alone to fight,